Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. In addition to running the Tudor Chest, you may know, or maybe not, that I'm also the co-director of Simply Tudor Tours, a historic tour company that I run alongside my colleague Sarah Morris, known to many of you as the Tudor Travel Guide. We have just launched our May 2026 tour, Mary, Queen of Scots, From Crown to Captivity, and it's now open for bookings. This incredible week-long experience takes in many of the most iconic historical sites associated with Mary in her native Scotland, taking in Stirling Castle, Edinburgh Castle, the Palace of Holyrood House, and many more. Featuring Dr. Anna Turnham as our historian in residence and featuring talks from noted historians including Dr. Linda Porter, this tour will also feature some fun, thoroughly Scottish experiences, including a very nice whisky tasting experience. To discover more on this and secure your place on this or one of our other live tours, or to sign up for latest updates, just head to simplytudortours.com. Tudor portraiture is a subject which I find endlessly fascinating, from the amazing full lengths of Henry VIII to the tiniest miniatures of his queens. Tudor portraits tell us a story, but there is often more to the story of the portraits themselves than we actually know about. Today, to discuss several Tudor portraits, some very well known and others less so, I'm pleased to welcome back Sylvia Barbara Soberton onto the show. Sylvia's latest book, Secrets of the Tudor Portraits, is packed full of little details, tidbits of information and facts that change how we view many of these incredibly famous faces. So sit back and relax as you find out a lot of new information about some of the portraits that you think you know everything about. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 85, Secrets of the Tudor Portraits with Sylvia Barbara Soberton. Welcome to the Tudor Chess Podcast, Sylvia Barbara Soberton. How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
Good to have you back on the podcast again. This is actually your third time.
Oh, is it? Well, thank you so much for having me, Adam. It's always a great pleasure.
Oh, you're very welcome. Well, the reason that you're back is that you're here to talk about your latest book. You seem to be able to produce books pretty quickly. It's very impressive. This one is a bit different because it's looking at the secrets of Tudor portraits. So when did you start writing this? You know, is it a project that's been going on for a while?
Yes, actually, it was going for a while. It started as a book. I started with researching the sketch of the Lady Parker from the Royal Collection. It's by Hans Holbein. And when I was researching that sketch and the identity of the lady, I've decided to write a book about Tudor portraits because I find Tudor portraiture in general very, very interesting subject. And we are lucky to have so many great portraits. And I feel like we are so well acquainted with the Tudors through their portraiture. So it's really a great subject to research.
Yeah, I think that's a big part, actually, of why the Tudors are so intoxicating. It's not just the crazy story, but it's also the fact that we know what a lot of them look like. We have so much more in the way of portraiture, both contemporary and later, than we do with earlier dynasties like the Plantagenets and the Normans and so on. So the richness and the sheer quantity of the portraits, I think, is a really big part of why we're so fascinated by them.
Yeah, I agree.
So referencing the Lady Parker sketch, this book started by accident then, I guess. You were examining the Lady Parker sketch and you developed a new theory off the back of this research on the sketch. So what is that theory?
So the sketch is currently identified as Grace Newport Parker. She was Jane Boleyn's sister-in-law. And the sketch is inscribed as Lady Parker, and it's often linked with Jane Boleyn, and it's often said to be Jane Boleyn. So when I was researching Jane, I've decided to take a closer look at this sketch to see if there are any links between Jane and the sketch. And as I was looking for candidates who could have been this Lady Parker, I realized basically that the only Lady Parker who was very prominent at court at the time when Holbein was active as a painter was Susanna Hornbout, who married John Parker, who worked at the Tudor court. So that was very interesting how this idea developed. I wrote a paper. It was published in the Royal Studies Journal. It's free access, so anyone can read it. And on the back of that research, I've decided to go further and research more Tudor portrait and see what kind of secrets are hiding behind them.
Okay, so it's your belief that the sketch Holbein painted is of another painter, basically?
Yeah, basically, yes.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? People don't know that there were actually two Hornbouts kicking around, and one of them was a woman.
Actually, three
there were three.
Because the father, Gerard, and the son, Lucas, and the daughter, Susanna. There's also this theory that Lucas's wife was also a miniaturist and painter. Prolific family, prolific artists. Gerard started working at the court of Margaret of Austria, and he was later snapped up by the Tudors. So he came with his entire family, his children and his wife. Of course, Susanna as a woman doesn't get as much attention because even if the miniatures that we're looking at were painted by her, they are naturally ascribed to either Gerard or her brother Lucas. But recently, one of the miniatures was also identified as coming from Susanna, the one which was from the Compton Verney gallery, which was labeled in the past as Catherine Parr, but it's now labeled as Lady Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's elder daughter, and it's said to be painted by Susanna because both of her brother and her father were dead by the time that miniature was painted. So she's the only candidate from the Hornbout workshop who could have painted that. So that's very exciting. You know, she has a face. Now we have a miniature of hers. That's great, you know.
So the first portrait that you do a deep dive into is the stunning and massive, it's really big, full length of Margaret Beaufort that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London. So firstly, I had no idea until reading your book that this is the earliest known full-length portrait of an English woman. That's correct?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's when you go into the National Portrait Gallery, this portrait stares at you. It's huge. And you have a feeling when you look at it that you are with Margaret there with her. And I'm going to just look at this portrait to describe it to you. So at first it looks like it's an expression of her piety because she kneels in front of her prie-dieu. She has her hands clasped in prayer, and in front of her she has a book of hours. So she's obviously caught in prayer or meditation. And the whole scene probably it takes place in her private oratory. But if you go further if you look closer, then you will see that this is also an expression of her wealth and her status, because she is kneeling beneath this cloth of estate. It's from cloth of gold. We have her coat of arms everywhere. Book of hours in front of her is very expensive thing to be owning in the 16th century. So if you could afford a book of hours, you were very fortunate. So there's cloth of gold everywhere. And the fact that she's kneeling beneath the cloth of estate says a lot about her status, because only the king and his family could sit or walk or stand beneath a cloth of estate. So that's an expression of her piety, but also an expression of her wealth, her status as the king's mother.
Yeah, and I don't believe it's contemporary. It was created for John Fisher a few years after she died, I think.
Yeah, so basically this painting was from what I can say from my research is that it was painted from life, probably, but it was later copied many times. And it must have been the painting that was associated with Margaret throughout the Tudor period, because so many copies of it survive. So it's also, I think, the way she wanted to have been remembered, because she's not only pious in it, but she's also the king's mother. You can clearly see that from the painting. So it's interesting that this very portrait was linked with Margaret, and that it became her face and her posture and everything that later artists copied this portrait. And a lot of versions are now surviving throughout various collections in the UK. So I would say she was very successful in creating her image.
Yeah, well, I think something about Margaret Beaufort that I don't think we see it in any other portrait series of any other characters from Tudor history, but in every single portrait of Margaret, she's wearing exactly the same thing. It's always the same. Whereas in the many portraits of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, etc., there's always some difference in what they wear. But with Margaret, it's the black dress with the long white gable hood. It's almost nun-like.
Yeah, but it's a little bit deceiving, isn't it? Because she took a vow of chastity, basically, and she's representing herself as this widow, chaste widow. But if you look her household accounts, she had some expensive clothes, and she wore some really, other clothing. We just have to imagine her wearing, like cloth of gold, velvet, and scarlet and stuff like that. But I think it's not an accident that she wanted to portray herself like this, and not in sumptuous clothing. Although, she also expressed her rank through clothing when she was taking part in events of the state, or, when ambassadors came. So she wasn't always wearing this, somber clothing that we see her portrayed in. But I think it was part of her image as the king's mother.
Well, as you said earlier, the cloth of estate I suppose, was doing the work here, wasn't it? That was the thing that was conveying her royal rank.
Yeah.
So the clothing is almost... The clothing's her way of conveying piety, and the cloth of estate is doing the rest for her.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
So for the next painting that you examine is the Whitehall mural. So for people who may not know what the mural actually is, can you describe it for me?
Yeah, so I'm going to just open this here so I see this when I describe it. Okay, so the Whitehall mural is no longer extant, basically. It was painted on the wall of Henry VIII's privy chamber at Whitehall Palace, hence why it's called the Whitehall mural. And Whitehall Palace burnt in the 17th century. But before it burned, Remigius van Limpet, the artist who worked in England, created a copy. It's a smaller copy, but it gives us a good example of what the original may have looked like. So we see Henry VIII with his father and with his mother and with Jane Seymour. They stand I assume it's a great hall, maybe of Whitehall Palace, and there's this obelisk in the center. And according to the Latin inscription of this obelisk, Henry VIII was made for greater things. The quotation goes. So he surpassed his father in greatness, if you like. Basically, this is a portrait that shows the Tudor dynasty. So Henry, his father, his mother, and Jane Seymour, who gave birth to Henry VIII's only legitimate male heir, Prince Edward, who later became king. An interesting thing about it is that we know that Henry VIII really loved his mother, Elizabeth of York. And there is one citation from the primary sources. I don't remember how exactly it goes, but basically it says that Henry told one of the ambassadors that his late mother was the best and the most pious and most exemplary woman that ever lived. So no wonder, he really loved her. And to Henry, probably, Jane Seymour came closest to becoming like Elizabeth of York. So she was, demure and pious, and she gave birth to the son that he really wanted for so many years. Some historians say that Henry VIII tried to portray himself as masculine and his father as a weaker figure, because Henry VII wears no beard in this portrait, whereas Henry VIII has a beard, and the beard is an expression of his masculinity. But an interesting thing is that Henry VII was famously clean-shaven. He never wore a beard. So I don't think that it's an attempt by Henry VIII portrayed his father as this maybe less masculine, weaker figure. He was just trying to stay true to the historical accounts, I think, of his father.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I also know that in the original sketch designed, Henry VIII's head was in 3/4 view, but in the final mural it shows him facing fully forward.
It's the same pose as in Holbein's painting by Henry VIII. So I think Holbein just took Henry VIII's like the pattern and copied it to this, to this mural. So it's really beautiful, and it's a pity that it doesn't survive, because I think the original must have been really impressive. But we at least have this copy by Remigius van Limpert, so we can see what Henry VIII envisaged for himself and his entire family. So that's very interesting. There's a little dog on Jane Seymour's gown. I'm looking at it right now. Dogs were symbols of loyalty. So again, a deliberate way of depicting Jane as the mother of the Tudor dynasty, although she died in childbirth and, had only one son, but the son became king, and it meant a lot to Henry VIII.
And that obelisk with the writing in the middle, I assume that was something that Henry VIII probably instructed to be done. He wanted this portrait to convey the greatness of his reign over his father's, basically.
Yeah, definitely. I included this, the translation of the Latin in the book, and it says, for example, that if it pleases you to see the illustrious images of heroes, look on those. No picture ever bore greater. So it starts pretty well. The great debate, competition, and great question is whether father or son is the victor, for both indeed were supreme. The former often overcame his enemies and the conflagration of his country, and finally brought peace to its citizens. The son, so Henry VIII, born indeed for greater things, how humble of him, removed the unworthy from their altars and replaces them by upright men. So this is a nod to the Reformation. The arrogance of the popes had yielded to unerring virtue, and while Henry VIII holds the scepter in his hand, religion is restored, and during his reign, the doctrines of God have begun to be held in his honor. So it's really about the Reformation and how Henry VIII purified and cleansed the country from the Catholic, I don't know how to say, doctrines. Yeah. So it's very interesting how he decided to portray himself, and it's very interesting. I remember when I was writing about this, I was like, wow, that sentence that Henry VIII was born for greater things, says a lot about him and what he thought about himself.
There's a lot of imposter syndrome going on there, isn't there?
Probably.
So I'd like to move on to talk about the portraiture of Mary Tudor, Queen of France, later Duchess of Suffolk. I found this chapter so fascinating, but also quite frustrating, because it seems like we've been robbed, really, of decent portraits of Mary. There were several, based on your book, there were several that were from life that are now lost. And the first one you discussed, you mentioned, included a parrot, I believe?
Yeah, so you said it very well, that we are basically robbed of portraits of Mary, because she was so frequently portrayed by various artists, and it's such a pity that none of those portraits survive today. We know about some of them. For example, the one that I mentioned in the beginning of the book, the one with the parrot, was in the collection of Margaret of Austria. And it was in Margaret's collection because Margaret's nephew, Charles of Castile, who later became Charles V as the Holy Roman Emperor, was engaged to Mary. They were engaged for several years, from 1507 to 1514, so quite a long time. But the marriage never took place, because Mary married Louis XII of France instead. And during the years when Mary was engaged to Charles, Margaret of Austria took a great interest in Mary. Like, what was she like? What did she look like? What did she like to do? Is she clever? Is she intelligent? And she sent one of her artists. I speculate in the book that this might have been Michael Sitow, to portray Mary and send the portrait to Margaret. And it's such a pity, again, that the portrait with the parrot doesn't survive. Mary was praised for her beauty. People who saw her were very impressed with what she looked like. And I would really like to see what she really looked like. If she was maybe like a female version of Henry VIII, if you like. People praised Henry for good looks as well in his youth. And she had red hair and, pale complexion and bright eyes. So I assume that she shared a lot of characteristics of Henry VIII.
Yeah, and I have to admit that the most well-known portrait of her, the one where she's painted alongside Charles Brandon, she isn't unattractive in that, but I wouldn't look at it and go, oh my God, she's a ravishing beauty. But Princess Mary was seen as being very, very beautiful. And that portrait, the most well-known one of her, doesn't really convey that, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because if you look at miniatures of Henry VIII, you wouldn't say that he's attractive, at least from my view. But he was praised by so many independent witnesses. So I don't think they were trying to flatter him because they didn't really have anything to gain from flattering a foreign king. So there are so many descriptions of Henry as a young man where people go and say, wow, he's so handsome, he's so athletic and he's such a great huntsman and so on, So I would say that maybe sometimes you see attractive people and they don't just photograph that well. In our times, they are not photogenic, we would say today. So maybe people like Henry VIII just didn't look well on miniatures or portraits, but were attractive in person. Who knows?
Yeah, I also enjoyed the story relating to a sketch of Mary and a comment made by King Francis I. What am I talking about here?
Okay, so you are talking about a sketch of Mary in the album The Ikes. It's a collection of 15th and 16th century sketches of various important persons from the French court. And there is Mary's sketch in there. And Francis wrote a little comment about her. And this comment is translated into English as more dirty than queenly. But it's a mistranslation. It should be read as more foolish than queenly or more fool than a queen. So it's not that naughty as implied by the English translation. Basically, what Francis was referring to was the fact that Mary remarried within a month of Louis XII's death. She married Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, who came to collect her and bring her back to England. They basically married within a month, which was highly scandalous because if Mary became pregnant, there was really no way of telling whose child she was carrying, whether it was Louis XII's or Charles Brandon's. And that was a potential threat to Francis I's kingship, because he wasn't the king's son. He was the king's heir, but not the king's son. So if Louis XII had a child with Mary, that would seriously threaten Francis's kingship. So that was what he was referring to, that she was foolish to marry so quickly with such haste and threw away her status as the Dowager Queen of France.
And do we still have that sketch?
Yeah, we do. There's actually a lot of copies of it, but the original that still survives in that album is extant, and it shows her with quite a long oval face. And the later copies don't show that. The later copies are so much different than the original. That's really strange.
Yeah, so you also cover the portraiture of her second husband, Charles Brandon. Charles is believed to have been born in 1484, but you believe that there's a clue in the Southwich portrait of him that tells us otherwise.
So when I was researching Charles's portraiture, I came across a reference to a portrait that was once hung at Southwick Hall, and it was later sold to the National Portrait Gallery. So the Southwick portrait now is preserved in the National Portrait Gallery. And there was this sketch of this portrait. The sketch was from 1736, and according to that sketch, Charles was, I think, the date is 1544 and his age is 62 or 64. So by inference, it means that he was born in around 1480 and not 1484, as is usually assumed. And so naturally that was something that I was very interested about. So I went down that rabbit hole to chase that reference. I've contacted several historians and the archivists in the National Portrait Gallery, and they are aware that this inscription was part of the portrait, but currently that portrait doesn't have the inscription. So the idea is that perhaps at some point in time, the portrait was cut or the frame was changed so that the inscription is no longer there, but it was there. And they have the correspondence between the person who sketched that, made that sketch, and, basically back and forth. And why is it not, the inscription, why is it not there anymore, and stuff like that. It's the 1484 date of birth is conjectural, so the 1480 date is probably as likely as the 1484, but because we don't have any other corroborating evidence, we can't really say with 100% of certainty that the 1480 is the correct date of his birth. But I will be looking into it in more detail, probably. I would much rather, I would much rather find a date of birth of Anne Boleyn than Charles Brandon, to be honest. To finally answer that question.
Yes, aren't you? Don't you think 1504?
I'm definitely not 1507. That's for sure. Definitely not. And I allow any date between 1501 and 1505. Because,
I'm fully 1507.
Oh my gosh, are you?
Yeah, no, I am.
But
1507 all the way.
I recently wrote a article for my Substack. So go and read that, because that's very interesting and you will change your mind. I promise you.
I think the reason 1507 makes a lot more sense is, to my knowledge and belief, Anne's age is never mentioned, even by her enemies. And were she 32,
Never.
33 at the point that she's marrying Henry, then surely that would have been brought up, that is getting old by the standards of the day to be marrying and producing a child. In fact, several children ideally. And the fact that the king went ahead with the marriage that her age is never mentioned as a potential blocker, for me, is key evidence that she was likely born at that later date.
But you know what I'm going to tell you? I'm going to surprise you a little bit here, because it's our projections that people back then felt or were considered old at 30. That's how we project. There are some letters from William Fitzwilliam, who was writing when he was in his early 30s. And he said about himself, "I'm a young man." And he's like 32-ish. So that's, when I was reading that, I was interested. I was intrigued, because I thought to myself, shouldn't he be, thinking about himself, I'm a middle-aged man by the standards of my epoch, but not really. And, not to go off topic here because we are talking portraits, but Anne Boleyn, one of Anne Boleyn's chaplains, Matthew Parker, who later became Elizabeth I's Archbishop of Canterbury, said that he was Anne's poor countryman, which meant that he was from the same county, and he was from Norfolk. And the Boleyns moved to Hever in Kent in 1505. So that's why I think she must have been born before 1505. So I'm definitely not about 1507. I'm not a fan of that date. It just doesn't line up with what we know about Anne Boleyn's life. But of course, I would love to find the date to finally answer that question. That's if she was before me right now, I would ask her about her year of birth.
Oh, totally. That would be the first thing I would say. I'd be like, when were you born? Exactly. We need it clearing up, Anne. You don't know how much it drives us all mad.
Tell me. Exactly, yeah.
To move on to the Six Wives of Henry VIII, you start by looking at portraiture of Katherine of Aragon, and something that is very seldom discussed, which is whether she inherited what became known as the Habsburg jaw. So what is this? What is the Habsburg jaw, and what is the evidence in Catherine's portraiture that she may have suffered from it?
So the Habsburg jaw is another way of describing the condition that is known as prognatism in medical terms. It is often called a Habsburg jaw because a lot of Habsburgs had that condition, but the medical term for it is prognatism, and it's about when the lower jaw is protruding and it's not closing properly. And of course, Katherine of Aragon was not a Habsburg, but prognatism was a trait that ran in many noble and royal families in the medieval and early modern period. And the thing that's never discussed when it comes to Katherine of Aragon is that, for example, her half-uncle, Henry IV of Castile, had prognatism, as is confirmed by his skeletal remains. And her brother also had something, perhaps prognatism, but the description was that he had a weakness of her lower lip. So whatever that was, whether it was prognatism, cleft lip, we don't know. Something was going on. And Francis I famously said that Katherine of Aragon was deformed, that Henry VIII had old and deformed wife. And a lot of historians assume that he was talking about her figure, spoiled by many pregnancies. But I think that he was talking about her face and about the fact that her lower jaw was protruding. And we have, very importantly, pictorial evidence for this, because in the Victoria and Albert Museum there is this game piece from Hans Kels's workshop. Hans Kels was a German, and it shows Katherine of Aragon from profile, and she very clearly has an open protruding jaw. And in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna there is also a game piece from the same workshop showing Katherine facing the viewer, and she's in the same costume. So no wonder that the same depiction comes from the same workshop. And it's interesting that the miniatures and portraits that were painted in England rarely show her with very prominent jaw. I think there was an attempt to hide that. But a portrait that is almost never reproduced, I would say never reproduced in Catherine's biographies, is currently in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and it was painted by Johannes Corvus, a Flemish artist. And it shows Katherine, there's something, she looks like she's clenching her mouth so very hard. So definitely pictorial evidence is there, visual evidence and descriptions. I'm looking for more descriptions from foreign ambassadors to confirm. Maybe someone else picked up upon it and commented, because a lot of descriptions of Katherine were never translated into English. So that's an interesting subject to further research, but I think that it's really plausible that she had prognatism. Yeah, it is. Maybe just a second. Is this a copy? Maybe it's a copy because the portrait is in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And you will probably know this portrait from various copies because the 18th century copy was very, very popular. And it's the portrait that first comes up when you Google Katherine of Aragon's portraits.
Is this the portrait you're referring to?
Yeah, so that's a copy from the 18th century. Mm-hmm.
That's fine. I'll share the portrait with people so they know what I'm talking about.
It is, yeah. But the Boston, the copy at Boston is really interesting because it shows very like she's clenching, like she's trying very hard. There's this tension in her mouth, which is very interesting.
This is the one that's identical to the one in the National Portrait Gallery. Yeah, so that for me, that's the quintessential Katherine of Aragon. That's the one when I think about her, I picture that portrait. I'm looking at it now. Yeah, you can see the chin and lower jaw is protruding a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and it's the portrait painted from life. It's interesting. By Johannes Corvus, the Flemish painter who was working in England. Yeah, he's also a fascinating, character because not a lot is known about him. So he, not only Hans Holbein was a foreign portrait artist who worked in England, but uh, definitely a lot of questions arise from this subject.
So jumping ahead to Catherine's successor, Anne Boleyn, I wanted to discuss the most famous portrait of Anne, the one we all think of when we think of her. The quintessential image is the one in the National Portrait Gallery. But your research has uncovered that, sadly, firstly, it probably looks nothing like the real woman, or at least isn't particularly close. I didn't realise until I looked, and you basically ascertained that the face is identical to 3 other portraits of other very notable Tudor women. Basically across these 4, so the portrait of Anne and then 3 other portraits, it's the same face. Can you explain this to me? Who are these people that I'm talking about?
Okay, so the portrait of Anne Boleyn from the National Portrait Gallery, as you say, it's iconic. It's the first image that I often think about when I think about Anne. But it was it dates to the 1584, so it's from the later Elizabethan period. And for many years it was believed that it was painted from the lost original. But I personally don't think so, because there is a portrait of Elizabeth I at Compton Verney Gallery, and there are exact same brush strokes around the lower part of Elizabeth and Anne's faces. And those are exactly the same. So I don't think it's coincidental, because maybe a lot of people will think, well, a resemblance between a mother and daughter. But to have the exactly same brush strokes around the same parts of the face means that it's probably one picture is copied from the other. So my idea is that Elizabeth's face was used as the pattern for Anne's. And when I first pointed this out in one of my blog posts, I was contacted by Dr. Owen Emerson, who kindly provided more details and revealed that the same unknown artist who painted the National Portrait Gallery portrait of Anne Boleyn also probably painted the Hever Corridor portrait of Katherine of Aragon and the Weiss Gallery portrait of Mary I. And if you look at those portraits, you will really see that the faces are the same. So if the National Portrait Gallery of Anne Boleyn is not what she really looked like, definitely. So the search continues.
Well, I actually had a look, and it was very helpful that you included the side-by-side of the portrait of Elizabeth with Anne, and I made a sort of small circle with my finger so that I could just see the facial features in the Elizabeth one, and you can see it is the same face.
Yeah, you can see it, yeah. That is exactly the same face. So the pattern was used for Anne's face. Maybe not accidentally. Maybe Elizabeth wanted to, convey this idea that Anne Boleyn was the proto-Elizabeth, and she was, there's so much recently about the relationship between Anne and Elizabeth, and Elizabeth really helped to create Anne's image during her later reign. So it's to me it's very interesting, and I would really love to find the lost portrait of Anne Boleyn. I would really love to see what she really looked like. I know it's not the most important thing about her, but yeah, I'm dying basically to know what she looked like.
Yeah. I think that the Lyndhurst in New York, I think, is underneath that. Underneath that is an original. I think underneath the Lyndhurst is the long-lost missing Lumley portrait, and that the Lyndhurst is the Lumley with overpainting. I had Elizabeth Levasse on my podcast a few months ago as she proposed this theory, and I think there's a lot to it. We'll just have to wait and see. So you also examine a portrait that caused a bit of a stir about a decade ago. We all got very excited because news broke that a discovery had been found of a portrait of Anne Boleyn. The discovery was made by none other than Alison Weir, and a portrait that she conjectured was actually a contemporary of Anne, which was long thought to be Joanna Neville, Baroness Bergavenny. Now, although you were unable to conclude whether it is Anne Boleyn, you do conclude that it's certainly not Joanna Neville. So how did you come to this conclusion?
So I definitely allow the possibility that the portrait that we know and reference as Lady Bergavenny may be Anne Boleyn. And I describe why I believe so in the book. And why I believe that it's definitely not Joanna Neville, Lady Bergavenny, is because first Horace Walpole made the identification, and he believed that this Lady Bergavenny was a poetress, a writer. So he basically confused her with someone else. And the real Lady Joanna Neville died between 1st June of 1508 and 16 May 1509, and the lady in the portrait wears clothing that dates to the 1520s. So I think it's highly unlikely that Joanna Neville, who died between 1508 and 1509, would have been painted wearing clothes fashionable a decade later. That's my main concern about this identification and the fact that Walpole was initially thinking about other women and basically said that it was Joanna Neville. He identified her as Joanna Neville based on the necklace and the letters in this necklace and the letters on her headdress, which are A, and what some historians interpret as I for Jane, the Latin Iana in Latin, Jane in Latin. But I don't think that she would have been painted in different clothing than the one that she wore in her lifetime. So basically, I definitely think it's not Jane Neville. It must be someone else. And in the book, I allow the possibility that it is Anne Boleyn, but more research needs to be done on the original. I've seen the original, the photograph of the original, but it's not the same base as if you would see this in person. And I think dendrochronological analysis is needed in order to establish when was it painted. If it's not maybe from later period than the Tudor period. So a lot of investigation is still required in order to find the identity of the sitter. The clothing, the necklaces, the gold, it all indicates that she was of the higher echelons of nobility. And I also propose that she may have been Eleanor Stafford, the Duchess of Buckingham. And I go into details in the book why. So if anyone's interested, just go and buy my book.
The next portrait I'd like to discuss is the miniature by Holbein, which has long been suggested to be Katherine Howard. I've actually seen it in the flesh and it is absolutely tiny. So miniature is the right word here. There's been some discussion that it could be Anne of Cleves more recently, but the suggestion that it's Katherine Howard is connected to the jewellery being worn by the sitter, specifically a necklace, which is believed to be part of the official collection of jewels belonging to Henry's queen consorts. But you refute this. How? How are you able to refute this?
Yeah, so we know that this miniature is linked to Katherine Howard from the 18th century, when it was a sketch was made and it was inscribed as Katherine Howard. And David Starkey, in his book about the Six Wives of Henry VIII, argued that the necklace with a pendant worn by the sitter is the same piece that Henry VIII gave to Katherine Howard to celebrate their marriage in 1540. But I've compared the necklace from the inventory with the necklace that the sitter is wearing, and in my opinion, it's not the same necklace. I counted the pearls and all, and in my view, it's not the same necklace. But also, what's an interesting thing, a lot of historians assume that this is a consort necklace because it was found in portraits of Henry VIII's wives. But this particular pattern of a pendant was very popular in Europe at this time, at this period, and I produce several pictures of paintings of other noblewomen who wore similar pendants. For example, there is a famous family portrait of a Cobham family at Longleat, and little girls, 5-year-old girls, wear this necklace with the same pendant. and they were not queens. So I don't think that it's a consort's necklace. And anyway, Tudor noblewoman would have copied whatever a queen was wearing. So to say that this is a queen based only on the fact that she's wearing this type of necklace, I think is misleading. At the same time, I think because we don't really have better evidence, I would say that because the identification was made in the 18th century as Katherine Howard, so maybe for now we should conclude that this is Katherine Howard. But by the necklace alone, I wouldn't say that it's her, and I wouldn't use that as a main argument of her identity.
Yeah, I have to admit, it's never struck me as feeling like it does depict Catherine. It doesn't. I know you shouldn't say it just doesn't feel right, but it doesn't look right to me. The sitter looks too old. I think there is something in what Franny Moyle says about it being Anne of Cleves. But as you say, until fresh evidence comes out, we're always going to be wondering, aren't we?
Yeah, you know what? The evidence comes up almost regularly, I would say. So I'm hopeful that one day we will be able to see the real face of Katherine Howard. I think that her portrait or a miniature is preserved somewhere in a collection. Maybe not labeled as Katherine, who knows? But I believe, I'm a believer.
Yeah, I think there is something to the one in New York. It's in the Met in New York. It sort of popped out about 10, 15 years ago, and it's been on Gareth Russell's book.
That one, yeah.
You know the one I mean? Yeah. I think there's something in that. I think that feels more like how Catherine would have looked and appeared, but again, it's just conjecture. I do know, you know, the 3/4 length portrait believed to be of Elizabeth Seymour in a big black.
Yes, I know, in black, yeah.
For a while, people said was Katherine Howard, and then they went away from that idea. I do know that that portrait's been revisited by Susanna Lipscomb, and she thinks that there could be something to it being Catherine. So we might be going right back the other way.
Oh, that's very interesting. You know, I really like that portrait. It's a really nice depiction. And, you know, she's wearing gold. So she's, again, that's a clue, you know, because not everybody was allowed to wear gold. So maybe a duchess, maybe a marchioness, maybe a queen.
Well, it's black as well. You know, black, that's very, very expensive.
Yeah, very expensive and linked with royalty, yeah.
That could be another sign that the portrait is of a potential queen. So the next portrait that I wanted to touch on, I suppose, occasionally portraits can really govern how we think about a historical figure, sometimes in a negative sense. And in this example, we're talking about a portrait that was believed to be of Frances Grey, the mother of Lady Jane Grey. And the irony is that what we're talking about here is not a portrait of Frances Grey. The portrait was fully mislabeled, but for centuries has been shown, people believed it's her, and it's sort of helped paint her negative perception. So if it isn't her, who actually is this portrait of?
So we have this portrait of Hans Eworth, of a woman who is 37, and next to her stands a younger man. He's 21. And for many, many years, for centuries, this was labeled as Frances Grey and her younger husband, Adrian Stokes. And it was said of her that she's parading this younger man, you know, as her trophy husband. Look, he's 15 years younger than me. And and Dr. Susan Foister pointed out that this is not Frances Grey and her younger husband, because they were not of the ages, the same ages as when the portrait was painted. And anyway, Adrian Stokes was not 15 years younger than Frances Grey. He was some 4 years younger than her. Or maybe they were even of the same age. I don't remember now. But anyway, this is not Frances. And this painting was used to blacken her reputation as, you know, female Henry VIII, because the sitter looks quite like Henry VIII in the face. And the real person who is depicted is actually Mary Fiennes, Baroness Dacre, and her son, Gregory. And this painting was Mary's way of showing her son as the next baron, because his father and Mary's husband was executed. So Gregory didn't really have an easy way to inherit his father's title and lands and manors. And she fought for Gregory receiving all of that. And so she was very, very formidable, very tenacious. And she also used portraiture to portray herself as perpetual widow, although she remarried and had other children, but she always depicted herself as a widow. There are at least two more portraits of Mary Fiennes. One represents her as sitting and writing a petition to Queen Elizabeth I, and the other one is representing her as a young widow dressed in black. And yeah, so it's very interesting. This is the case of mistaken identity, and it's really interesting how a portrait can shape someone's reputation in that way. I think, Frances Gray would have been very surprised to know that she was said to be this woman when in reality she wasn't. So, yeah, that's interesting. And, Frances Gray is maligned because she moved on after her daughter's execution. So Jane Grey was executed in 1554. Frances, her mother, she remarried, had other children. And, there are so many myths attached to Jane Grey's name. And one of those myths is that her mother beat her, and that she had this difficult relationship with her mom, which is not really the case. Yeah, so that's how Frances Gray's reputation was shaped by one portrait of not her. Yeah.
On the subject of the Grey sisters, there are two portrait miniatures of Lady Catherine Grey, the middle daughter, so Jane's younger sister. And there's these two portraits of Catherine with her son Edward, that you discuss, and how it's believed that these were styled in a specific way to mirror Mary and the baby Jesus, and also the way that Catherine's son was being portrayed as the rightful successor to Elizabeth I. So can you break this down for me?
Yeah, so this is a miniature of Catherine Grey and of her son. The theory that she was portrayed, like Virgin Mary and her son as Jesus comes from historian Dr. Martin Spice, who first pointed this out. An interesting thing is that she gives the child an apple, and an apple was used to show, the power, the influence. So under the terms of Elizabeth of Henry VIII's last will, Catherine Grey was Elizabeth I's successor. And Catherine remarried without Elizabeth's permission or license. And Elizabeth was really angry. And she never forgave Catherine or her husband, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford. They were kept under house arrest, imprisoned. They had two children together. And one of the very interesting things about this miniature is that the younger son, Thomas, poses as the older son, Edward Lord Beauchamp, because Catherine had Thomas, the younger son, in her care, and the older son was with her mother-in-law. And of course, she wanted to make a political statement, that her firstborn son is the next heir. So she had her younger son styled as the older son and portrayed as, Edward Beauchamp. And we know that because one of the descendants of Catherine Grey described this painting as Catherine and her older son. So we know for sure that it was intended to show Catherine and Edward Lord Beauchamp. So at first it looks like, a normal family scene, a mother and her son, but it's really a powerful statement. And it really shows that Catherine Grey wasn't naive or gullible or stupid. She was intelligent and she knew what she was doing. She was trying to represent herself as the wife of Edward Seymour. She never accepted that her marriage was annulled. She represented her son as the next heir under the terms of Henry VIII's last will. So it's overall a very interesting and beautiful and quite heartbreaking depiction, because if you look at it and you see this, young mother and her child, and when you know how they ended, she died quite young. She was only 28. It is believed that
Possibly starved herself to death, didn't she? Yeah.
yeah, that she starved herself to death. So that's very tragic. She was certainly depressed because she was deprived of the company of her husband and her children later in her life. So very sad and very cruel on Elizabeth's part to separate them.
I have to admit, it's one of the stains on Elizabeth. It's one of the big ones.
Yeah,
It's a negative stain on her.
it's a
The
huge one.
treatment of
Yeah.
Catherine and Mary. Mary to a lesser degree because she does regain some of her position, but she came down very hard on Catherine. So on the subject of a different Mary, one of my favourite Tudor portraits is the one of Queen Mary the First, probably her most famous portrait by Antonis More. It feels very realistic. It really feels like you're looking at the real woman. But you suggested it's first of all, you believe it was painted before her marriage to Philip of Spain, and there's also quite a lot of symbolism in the jewels she's wearing. So can you expand on this for me?
Yeah. So we know that Charles V sent his court artist, Antonis More, to England in November of 1553, and that was early in Mary's reign. And Charles sent his artist to paint Mary so that he could see what she looks like now. And basically, she's depicted as this Habsburg consort sitting down. And the jewels are very interesting because she is wearing this jewel pinned to her breast. It's a jewel that Philip of Spain gave her, and it probably belonged to his late mother, the Empress Isabella of Portugal. Now, a lot of people will tell you probably that the pearl that hangs down from this jewel is La Peregrina, the famous pearl that was later bought by actor Richard Burton, and he gave it to his wife Elizabeth Taylor. But it's not the same pearl. The famed La Peregrina was sold in 1571, so a long time after Mary's death. And it was acquired, I think, as well after her death. So acquired and sold after her death. I remember doing the research and I was like, is it this pearl? Is it really La Peregrina? Because when you look at the pictures of La Peregrina, it's so interesting and so like it gives me goosebumps to know that that I'm looking at the same pearl as the one worn by Mary in her painting. But there are a lot of myths and legends around various paintings, and especially of paintings of the Tudors. So yeah, there is a new research that I cite in my book. I'm going to tell you whose research it is. Just a second. Peregrina. Just a second. Okay. The recent research shows that La Peregrina was bought in 1571, so acquired in 1571, 13 years after Mary's death. And it's from Monica Dominguez Torres, Pearls for the Crown, Art, Nature and Race in the Age of Spanish Expansion. She has really good research on pearls and especially on the pearls that belonged to Philip of Spain. Yeah. It's probably another rabbit hole to fall down into to research, Mary's pearls. Yeah, but it was acquired and then became part of the collection of the Spanish crown jewels as La Peregrina. So first probably recorded in the 1570s after Mary's death.
Well, at least Elizabeth Taylor went to her grave thinking it was the real thing.
No, actually not. They knew it was not La Peregrina because they've had this portrait of Mary from the National Portrait Gallery, and they did their research because they were told that it was the pearl that was worn by Mary Tudor, and they did their research and they concluded that it was not the same pearl. And you know what they did? They gave the portrait to the National Portrait Gallery. They donated it. That's the story from the biography of Elizabeth Taylor. That's very interesting.
Okay, so you also examined the Chequers Ring. Have you seen it in the flesh?
Yeah, I saw it in 2016 during the Lost Tudors, I think. What was the name of the exhibition? The Real Tudors. Oh, the Real Tudors. It was in Paris, of all places. And I didn't really expect to see that there, and it's so small. My
Yeah, that's what
goodness.
literally what I was about to say. I saw it at the British Library a few years ago. It was on display as part of an
Hmm.
Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots exhibition that they had on, and I could
Uh-huh.
not
Yeah.
believe just how tiny it was. I mean, the faces inside of the ring
Hmm.
are almost smaller than half of the size of your little fingernail. It's remarkable. I couldn't believe how
Yeah.
small it was.
Yes, exactly. When I went to Paris for that exhibition, I didn't really expect to see that ring there. And when I saw it, I was like glued to that exhibit, because it was so small and so beautiful. And it really made me admire the work of the artists who made it even more. Because, it must have been so difficult to work on it, to create those images within such a small ring.
Well, on to the faces inside the ring. There are three possible contenders for the face that
Mhm.
isn't the one of Elizabeth. The one that's there's these three suggestions. One is the overwhelmingly popular theory is that it's Anne Boleyn. Some people have said it could be a younger Elizabeth, and some have said that it could be Catherine Parr. But you conclude that for you, beyond doubt, it is Anne Boleyn. So what is the evidence for that?
So the evidence that really convinced me when I was researching this portrait, this ring, is the Phoenix iconography, and what it meant for Elizabeth. So in 1575, we have this poem by Ulpian Fulwell, who writes basically eulogies for Anne Boleyn, and he compares Anne to a phoenix, to a mythical bird. Phoenix is a bird who, according to myth, dies in flames and is reborn from its own ashes. And according to myth, only one phoenix can exist at any given time. So you will not see two phoenixes, for example. And it really, it was such a powerful depiction because Fulwell depicted Anne as phoenix who gave birth to another bird, to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth clearly loved this symbolism. And she adopted phoenix in her iconography. In the 1570s, we see, for example, the Phoenix portrait, where Elizabeth wears this jewel with the phoenix bird pinned to her dress. We see the phoenix jewel where she is shown in profile, wearing the same clothes as in the Phoenix portrait. And we see, of course, Phoenix in the Chequers ring on the bezel of that ring. And I think it's knowing what Phoenix meant for Elizabeth and that she used that to link it with Anne Boleyn. So it was really Elizabeth's silent tribute to her executed mother. And I think knowing this, there is no other way for me to believe that this is not Anne Boleyn in the Chequers ring. And it's so like in the past, I didn't believe it was Anne because I didn't know about the phoenix, what it meant for Elizabeth. But when I was researching this book, I came across this, Ulpian Fulwell's poem. And I was like, wow, that's really powerful. And that's probably why Elizabeth adopted the phoenix iconography in the 1570s following Fulwell's
Yeah, that
poem.
does. It makes sense. I mean, I've always felt that it's
That
her.
makes
It's
sense. Yeah,
clearly Anne.
a lot of sense. Like now, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that it's Anne. Yeah.
Now, regarding Elizabeth, now this is a bit of a controversial one, young lady, but you've put forward
Oh,
the quite convincing argument that the
yeah.
long-held belief about Elizabeth wearing a lot of heavy makeup doesn't actually appear in the records or in her portraits. So, can you expand on this for me?
So when I first started researching Elizabeth the first long time ago, one of the first thing that I wanted to know was whether she really wore, this heavy makeup, the white and red and people probably know what I'm talking about because in every movie about Elizabeth, she is depicted like white face, red lips, thin eyebrows. And I really wanted to know if there's any truth to it. And I found that people who saw Elizabeth, and especially during her later reign, towards the end of her life, never really commented upon the fact that she wore makeup. Also, Elizabeth knew that the makeup produced in her times, so with mercury in it, was probably not good for her, because people understood that mercury could do more damage than good, and that women who wore makeup with mercury had problems with their like dried skin and wrinkles. They were aging more rapidly. So Elizabeth was very careful about her diet, about her clothes, and I assume also about what she put on her face. And I must say that I'm also not the only one who also writes about this. Anna Reel, in her book about Elizabeth's depictions of Elizabeth, also questions this. And Stephen Virapan, historian, the biographer of James I, among other historical figures, also questions whether Elizabeth wore this makeup. So I'm very glad that I'm not the only one, because it's such a huge part of what we learn about Elizabeth, that she wore this makeup. So it's like almost a, how British people probably imagine Elizabeth, this makeup, So to dismantle that myth, to say, she didn't, is quite controversial, but I'm also very happy that this part of the narrative is also being questioned by various historians, including myself.
Yes, yeah. But she did use portraiture nonetheless to deceive people. So can you give me a couple of examples of that?
Yeah, so Elizabeth had introduced some regulations. So it was forbidden to take her likeness from life. And there was one pattern of her face that was accepted and reproduced in her portraits. And if you look at the early portraits of Elizabeth, that's probably what she really looked like, because she didn't have any influence over how she was portrayed as. Whereas towards the end of her life, she's portrayed as this radiant, goddess-like virgin queen, although she was old at that point. So you won't see that she's old in the paintings that were produced towards the ends of her life, because that's how she wanted to be portrayed, as this forever young, radiant, almost a goddess. So that's how she deceived people with portraiture.
So the final portrait that you examine is known as the allegory of the Tudor succession. It's kind of, I think the family of Henry VIII portrait is more well known. And this is kind of like the Elizabethan version of that. And it was designed in a way to greatly promote Elizabeth I's virtues and the success of her reign. How does this painting achieve this? And then how does it also slander the reign of her half-sister Mary?
Oh, yeah. So the allegory of Tudor succession, it was painted in the 1570s, and Elizabeth sent this painting to her ambassador in France, to Walsingham. So this fact means that she really wanted this painting to be circulated internationally. And I'm looking at this painting right now, and in front, like in the center, you have Henry VIII. Right next to him kneels his son, Edward VI. Mary is on the left with Philip of Spain, and they are accompanied by Mars, the god of war, the Greek god of war. And this is basically a reference to the fact that Mary sent her troops to help Philip in his military endeavors. And England very famously and tragically lost Calais as a result, the last English territory in France. Elizabeth is on the right side of the painting, and she is depicted accompanied by peace and plenty. So she is the good Queen Bess. She brings peace. She brings wealth and plenty. And that's a really interesting depiction. That's how she wanted to represent herself and her reign. Although when this painting was painted, she was in her early 40s, and it was not yet clear whether she would or wouldn't produce children. She probably knew that she will never marry and will never have children, but her counselors still fought to try and to force her to marry, to take care of the succession. And there's also another version of this painting painted towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, where we see her dressed in this gown from the 1590s. And that's probably where this cult of the Virgin Queen really took hold. And it was understood that she will not produce any children because she was old at that period. So it really is how this painting, in my view, should be entitled the Victory of the Virgin Queen, because she emerged victorious. Basically, she's the last Tudor, but although she has no children, she is basically the most important Tudor, because she ruled for 40 years. She was probably more famous and better remembered by posterity than Henry VIII or Mary I, for sure, than Mary I. So it's a really beautiful and interesting.
Yeah, this is kind of like her signing off in a way, isn't it? I'm out kind of thing.
That's me, I'm the Virgin Queen. Bow.
Yeah, and I wonder why Prince Edward is portrayed in sort of such a servile position.
Yeah, it's probably because he carried on with the Reformation. He carried on with his father's legacy. And if you look at what Mary did, she basically reintroduced Catholicism at great price in England. And Elizabeth, again, she returned to her father's and her brother's policies. And Edward died as a young boy, so he was like 15, 16. So basically, he was a minor. He never came of age. So probably that's why he's portrayed in this position, kneeling down as forever only a child, because he died so young.
So my final question, I think I know I'm going to know the answer to this before you say it, but you reference many lost portraits in this book. Which lost portrait would you love to find?
Well, so as you can tell, I am a Boleyn girl through and through. So my favorite lost portrait, the one that I would love to find, I would love to see, is the portrait of Anne Boleyn. Period.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be the same for me. It would be the contemporary of Anne Boleyn. We spoke earlier about the Lumley portrait. Mm-hmm. The Lumley portrait was actually a full length from life, and it was still hanging around at the start of the 18th century.
Yeah, but was it really from life?
I believe so, yeah. I think it claims to have been.
It is said that it was from life, but was it?
The records show that it was a full length, but was eventually cut down to 3/4 length because there was damage done to it in a fire. I mean, actually,
I think personally that we are more likely to find a miniature of her than a full-length portrait. A miniature of her, perhaps from the Hornbout workshop. She was famously ordering things from the Hornbout workshop, and Henry VIII sent her a miniature of himself, like a miniature in a bracelet he wrote in one of the love letters. So I think it's more likely that we will find a miniature than a full-length portrait. But who knows? Surprise me, universe.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's something to the theory around the Lyndhurst Lumley, but who knows? Mm-hmm. And then there's obviously the two Holbein sketches which have Anne Boleyn tied to them. And I don't think that the one with the double chin, the John Cheek one, I just don't think it's her.
Yeah, I do. I actually do. I think there's like 90% of chance that that's the real face of Anne Boleyn. Hiding in plain sight. Nobody believes it.
I know. I mean, yeah. Owen Emerson, he's convinced by it. And obviously, the man's an expert in Anne Boleyn portraiture. But I don't know, it just doesn't feel... Again, it's just feeling, but I just don't... It's not her for me. The one in the British Museum, though, I think is probably her. But it's all conjecture, essentially.
It is, yeah, it is. And it's interesting that, the most famous of Henry VIII's wives and the most divisive of Henry VIII's wives doesn't have a face. So, although I think if we look at Elizabeth's face, we will see Anne in there. I think she resembled her mother. Mary I commented that Elizabeth looked a lot like her mother. She had Henry VIII's red hair, but she had also this, oval face and black eyes of her mother. So, yeah.
Well, Well, thank you so much for coming on and having a chat. This has been so fascinating, and the book, as I've said, it's wonderful. It's so full of amazing little details. So people, if you're listening, it's called The Secrets of the Tudor Portraits. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it on Amazon and other places, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So, Sylvia, are you able to say what you're working on at the moment?
I think I am. I'm currently editing my book about Mary Boleyn. It's coming out next year, probably in May. But you will hear me talking about it more. But yeah, it's very exciting new project, and yeah, that's what I'm allowed to say.
Wonderful. And where can people find you on social media if they want to keep up to date with what you do?
I'm on Twitter, which is X now, I guess. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Blue Sky. So I'm basically everywhere except for TikTok. I'm not on TikTok. So yeah, you can find me there. Sylvia BSO. That's like Sylvia Barbara Soberton. That's my handle. Or Forgotten Tudor Women on Facebook. So yeah. So thank you so much for having me, Adam. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you. You're always so well prepared.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and a big thanks to Sylvia Barbara Soberton for coming back onto the podcast. Next week, I'm going to be speaking to my colleague and friend Sarah Morris all about Mary Queen of Scots and the sites that we're going to be taking when we're on tour in May of 2026. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess Podcast, and speak soon.